The October air carried the first bite of autumn, as the streets of Memphis glowed beneath rows of amber streetlights. Neon signs buzzed softly against the darkness, reflecting across rain-soaked pavement that shimmered like polished glass. The city had quieted after another busy Saturday evening, but one little roadside bar still pulsed with laughter, clinking glasses, and the sound of country guitars drifting through its wooden walls. No one inside expected history to walk through the front door. The bartender, Charlie Dawson, wiped the counter with an old white towel while watching a young comedian stumble through another set of jokes on the tiny stage near the jukebox. The place wasn't fancy. The walls were covered with faded concert posters, football pennants, and yellowed photographs of musicians who had once stopped by during better days. Every Saturday, they held an open microphone night. Anyone could sing. Anyone could tell jokes. Anyone could dream. Most never became anything more than another forgotten face. Charlie glanced toward the clock. Almost 10:30. The crowd had settled into the comfortable rhythm that only neighborhood bars understood. Factory workers laughed over cheap beer. Truck drivers argued about football. Couples danced whenever someone fed another quarter into the jukebox. Then the front door slowly opened. The conversations barely paused. A tall man stepped inside wearing a black leather jacket over a simple black shirt. Dark sunglasses hid his eyes despite the late hour. His hair was carefully combed back, though not with the exaggerated style people usually associated with celebrities. He looked tired, not sick, just exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that fame never allowed anyone to notice. Charlie looked up for barely 2 seconds before returning to polishing another glass. He had seen strangers every night. Nothing unusual. The man quietly walked toward a booth in the corner, far away from the stage. He didn't ask for attention. He ordered only one drink, iced tea. Charlie's eyebrow lifted. No whiskey? The stranger smiled politely. Not tonight. His voice carried something strangely familiar. Charlie couldn't quite place it. The young comedian on stage continued his routine. My girlfriend told me I spend too much time singing in the shower. Scattered laughter. So now I sing in the kitchen. A louder laugh. The room relaxed again. Meanwhile, the stranger sat alone, listening more than watching. He seemed interested in ordinary people. A young couple celebrating their anniversary. An elderly veteran quietly eating a hamburger. 3 construction workers arguing over whose truck was older. It felt peaceful, normal. For perhaps the first time all week, nobody expected anything from him. That was exactly why he had come. 3 hours earlier. Graceland had never felt so quiet. The mansion looked magnificent from outside, but inside its enormous rooms echoed with silence. Elvis Presley stood beside the upstairs window, looking across the front lawn, where fans gathered almost every evening hoping to catch a glimpse of him. They waved even when the curtains never moved. Some had traveled hundreds of miles. Others crossed entire states. They loved the legend, but very few knew the man standing behind the glass. Colonel Parker had left only an hour earlier after discussing another series of concerts. More shows, more television appearances, more interviews, more photographers, more expectations. Every schedule looked the same. Every performance demanded perfection. Every audience expected Elvis Presley. Sometimes, he simply wanted to be Elvis, not the king, just Elvis. His longtime friend Jerry entered quietly. You've been staring out that window for 20 minutes. I'm thinking. Dangerous habit. A small smile appeared. Jerry crossed his arms.
You need to get out.
I know. No reporters. I know. No casinos. I know. No fans. Elvis finally looked toward him. Do you know a place where nobody's looking for me? Jerry laughed. In Memphis? Good point. A silence settled between them. Then Jerry snapped his fingers. My cousin mentioned a little place near Highway 61. Fancy? Quite the opposite. Anybody recognize me? If they do, I'll buy you dinner. Elvis chuckled. You're confident. Nobody expects Elvis Presley to walk into a neighborhood bar and drink iced tea. 40 minutes later, they parked several blocks away. Jerry remained inside the car. You sure? I'll only stay an hour. Famous last words. Elvis smiled before pulling the leather jacket tighter around himself. No bodyguards. No entourage. No cameras. Just one man hoping to disappear into an ordinary evening. For a little while, it worked. Back inside the bar, the comedian finished another joke. Applause echoed politely. His name was Danny Brooks, 26 years old. Funny, confident, sometimes too confident. He dreamed of television, dreamed of Hollywood, dreamed of hearing strangers laugh because of something he had created. Tonight's audience liked him enough. But Danny wanted more. He wanted unforgettable. His eyes wandered across the room, searching for someone to involve. Audience participation always made people laugh. Then he noticed the quiet man sitting alone. Leather jacket, dark hair, handsome face, oddly familiar. Danny squinted. No. Could it be? Impossible. He smiled mischievously. Oh, this might be fun. He pointed toward the corner. You there. The stranger slowly looked up. You've been smiling at every joke. The room turned toward him. That's dangerous. A few chuckles. Danny continued. You look like somebody. More laughter. Actually, he leaned closer to the microphone, you look exactly like Elvis Presley. The room exploded with laughter. Several people turned around for a better look. One woman whispered to her husband, He actually does. Another man laughed loudly. Maybe it's his cousin. The stranger simply smiled. No denial, no confirmation. Danny saw an opportunity. If you're really Elvis, the audience leaned forward, give us a little hip shake. Everyone laughed again, even Charlie behind the bar. The stranger only raised his glass of iced tea. I think I'll pass. His southern voice rolled softly across the room. Something about that voice made Charlie stop wiping the counter. He stared. Wait. No, surely not. Danny grinned wider. Oh. You even sound like him. Another wave of laughter. Still, the man remained calm, not embarrassed, not irritated, almost amused. Danny wasn't finished. He had discovered something the audience enjoyed. So, tell me, he stepped closer to the edge of the stage, if you're Elvis Presley, what are you doing drinking iced tea? The stranger answered without hesitation. Trying to finish it. The timing was perfect. The room erupted. Danny laughed harder than anyone. Okay, I like you. You've got quick answers. He paused dramatically, but words are easy. He looked around the room before pointing directly at the stranger. Singing. Now that's different. Several people clapped immediately. Someone whistled. Another shouted, Yeah! Charlie quietly watched the stranger's expression. There wasn't fear. There wasn't annoyance. Only something deeper, something almost nostalgic. as though the word singing carried memories too heavy to explain. Danny sensed the crowd's excitement building. He smiled. "What do you say?" "If you're really Elvis," he shrugged playfully, "come prove it." The room erupted into cheers. Some pounded the tables, others laughed, convinced this was nothing more than a hilarious coincidence. Only Charlie remained unusually quiet. His heart had begun beating faster, because, suddenly, he remembered. About 5 years earlier, he had worked security backstage at the Mid-South Coliseum. Thousands of screaming fans, bright white jumpsuits, flashing cameras, and one brief moment, only a handshake lasting 3 seconds, but the smile, the voice, the eyes, the man sitting quietly in booth number 7. Charlie slowly lowered the towel from his hands. His mouth barely moved. "Oh, my God." Before he could say another word, the stranger calmly stood up. Every conversation disappeared, every chair stopped moving, every glass froze halfway to someone's lips. He adjusted the sleeves of his leather jacket. Then he looked toward the stage, toward Danny, toward the microphone waiting beneath the warm, yellow spotlight. A gentle smile crossed his face. Not the smile of a celebrity, not the smile of a performer, just the smile of a man who suddenly remembered why he had fallen in love with music in the first place. Without saying a single word, he took his first step toward the stage, and the entire bar became silent. The silence inside the little bar felt almost unnatural. Even the old ceiling fan seemed quieter. Danny Brooks stood frozen on the stage, one hand still wrapped around the microphone, the playful grin slowly fading from his face. A moment earlier, he had been certain he was teasing an ordinary customer who happened to resemble America's biggest music star. Now, he wasn't so sure anymore. The stranger walked through the narrow aisle at an unhurried pace, not with the swagger audiences expected, not with dramatic confidence, just slow, calm, almost humble. People instinctively moved their chairs aside without being asked. No one wanted to interrupt whatever was about to happen. Charlie Dawson felt his pulse pounding inside his ears. He whispered to the waitress beside him, "I think that's really him." The young waitress laughed nervously. "No." Charlie never looked away. "It is." Her smile disappeared. By the time the stranger reached the tiny wooden stage, the room had become so quiet that someone dropping a fork near the kitchen sounded like a gunshot. Danny swallowed. "So," he said with an awkward smile, "you decided to accept the challenge." The stranger nodded once. "You invited me." A few nervous laughs echoed through the room. Danny handed him the microphone. For the first time all evening, his confidence cracked. "You really sing?" The stranger looked directly into his eyes. "I've done it once or twice." More laughter, warm laughter, not mocking, relieved. Danny chuckled despite himself. "Fair enough." He stepped aside. The spotlight now belonged entirely to the man in black. The microphone felt strangely familiar in Elvis's hand. Thousands of microphones had passed through those fingers over the years. Massive arenas, television studios, movie sets, crowds of 20,000 screaming fans. Yet this tiny microphone, with faded silver paint and a loose cable, felt more intimidating than any of them. Because there was nowhere to hide, no orchestra, no backup singers, no flashing lights, only people. Real people. Exactly the kind of audience he had once dreamed of performing for, before the world knew his name. He looked around the room. Construction workers, a retired schoolteacher, young couples, truck drivers, a mother celebrating her birthday. Nobody wore expensive suits. Nobody represented a record company. Nobody wanted an autograph. They simply wanted entertainment. For a brief moment, Elvis envied them. Charlie slowly walked toward the ancient upright piano sitting near the stage. It hadn't been tuned in months. One of its highest keys refused to work. The pedals squeaked. Still, it had survived hundreds of Saturday nights. Charlie cleared his throat. "My brother usually plays." He looked embarrassed. "But he's sick tonight." He hesitated. "I know a few chords." Elvis smiled warmly. "That's all we'll need." Charlie blinked. "You don't mind?" "I started with less." The bartender slowly sat behind the piano. His hands trembled. He had played in church when he was younger. Never for Elvis Presley. Danny remained standing near the side of the stage. His heart had begun racing. He leaned toward Charlie. "Is that really?" Charlie whispered back. "If it isn't, I owe heaven an apology." Elvis looked around one final time. Then he spoke. Not as a superstar, not as the king, simply as a man. "You know, I came here tonight because I wanted one evening where nobody expected anything from me." The room remained perfectly still. "I thought maybe I could sit in a corner, drink my tea, listen to a few jokes, and remember what ordinary Saturdays feel like." Several people lowered their eyes. His words carried no bitterness, only honesty. But life has a funny sense of humor. Soft laughter drifted through the room. He glanced toward Danny. "I suppose you had other plans." The comedian smiled sheepishly. "I guess I did." Elvis nodded. No hard feelings. Danny suddenly felt his face burning with embarrassment. He remembered every joke, every sarcastic remark, every challenge. He had tried to make the audience laugh. Instead, he had unknowingly challenged Elvis Presley. His stomach tightened. "I'm sorry." The words escaped almost automatically. "I didn't know," Elvis answered gently. "You weren't supposed to." Someone near the back raised a hand. "What are you going to sing?" The question lingered in the air. Elvis looked toward the piano. Charlie waited. The room waited. Finally, Elvis smiled. "I think I'll sing something everybody knows." He looked at Charlie. "You know, Can't Help Falling in Love." Charlie almost laughed. "I've been trying to play it for 15 years. "Then tonight's the night." Charlie placed trembling fingers on the old piano keys. The first chord came out slightly flat. The second was better. The third settled into place. The familiar melody slowly floated across the room. Elvis closed his eyes, not to perform, to remember. Memphis. Sun Studio. His mother. The first guitar. The first applause. The first dream. He inhaled quietly. Then he sang. Wise men say the words barely rose above a whisper, yet somehow they filled every corner of the building. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical. It was effortless. The kind of voice that didn't demand attention. It simply earned it. Charlie forgot to watch his hands, his eyes filled with tears. Danny stared in disbelief. There were no tricks, no studio effects, no giant speakers, only a voice so rich that every note seemed to wrap itself around the room. A truck driver slowly removed his baseball cap. An elderly woman placed her hand over her mouth. A waitress stopped halfway through pouring coffee. The liquid overflowed onto the table. She never noticed. Outside, a passing couple heard the singing through the half-open front door. They stopped walking. What is that? I don't know. It sounds familiar. Curious, they stepped inside. Then another man followed. Soon, another. Word spread faster than anyone realized. People walking down the street paused. Someone whispered, "There's a man in there who sounds exactly like Elvis." Another answered, "No one sounds exactly like Elvis." The first man replied quietly, "You should come listen." Inside, Elvis reached the second verse. His confidence grew softer instead of bigger. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't chasing applause. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he wasn't singing because someone had sold tickets. He was singing because he loved the song. The audience could feel the difference. Danny had spent years studying performers. He knew when someone was acting. He knew when someone was forcing emotion. This was neither. This was completely genuine, and somehow that made it even more powerful. Charlie missed another chord. I'm sorry." Elvis smiled without stopping the song. "It's perfect." Charlie nearly cried. No famous singer had ever made him feel like he belonged. Yet here was Elvis Presley, encouraging him in front of a room full of strangers. Charlie found the next chord, then another. Little by little, his confidence returned. The old piano no longer sounded broken. It sounded alive. By the final chorus, every person inside the bar had unconsciously leaned closer. Even those who had never particularly cared for Elvis Presley understood they were witnessing something impossible. Not because the world's greatest entertainer was singing, but because, for those few precious minutes, he wasn't entertaining anyone. He was sharing a piece of himself. When the final words left his lips, "Take my hand," the room remained completely silent. No applause, no whistles, no shouting, only silence. The kind of silence that appears when people are too overwhelmed to remember they're supposed to clap. Elvis slowly lowered the microphone. He looked around the room. For a brief second, he wondered if perhaps he had disappointed them. Then, from the very back of the bar, came the unmistakable sound of someone quietly sobbing. An elderly man wiped tears from his eyes before standing to his feet. Without saying a word, he began to clap. One pair of hands, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire bar erupted into the loudest standing ovation the tiny building had ever heard. People weren't cheering for a celebrity. They were cheering for the man they had finally met behind the legend. And just as Elvis smiled and prepared to hand the microphone back, a trembling voice rose from the crowd. "Mr. Presley." The room fell silent again. The voice belonged to an elderly woman sitting alone near the window. She was holding something tightly against her chest. It was an old, worn photograph. And when Elvis saw it, the smile slowly disappeared from his face. The applause slowly faded, but the emotion inside the little bar refused to disappear. No one rushed back to their conversations. No one reached for another drink. For the first time in years, Charlie Dawson looked around his own bar and realized that every single person was sharing the exact same feeling. They had all witnessed something they would remember for the rest of their lives. Elvis gently placed the microphone on its stand. Then he looked toward the elderly woman. She was still standing. Her hands trembled as she held the faded photograph against her chest. The edges had curled with age, the colors had nearly disappeared. Yet she protected it as though it were the most valuable possession she owned. Elvis stepped down from the stage. He walked toward her slowly. The crowd instinctively moved aside, creating a path between them. When he finally reached her table, he smiled softly. "May I?" She nodded, unable to speak. He carefully accepted the photograph. His smile faded almost immediately. The picture showed a much younger Elvis. Not the superstar the world recognized, not the movie star, not the man in jeweled jumpsuits. This photograph had been taken years before all of that. A skinny young man stood beside an old pickup truck outside a tiny church. Next to him stood a teenage girl smiling at the camera. For several long seconds, Elvis simply stared. Then he whispered, "I remember this." The woman covered her mouth. "You do?" He nodded slowly. "I never forgot." The room became completely silent again. Danny exchanged a confused glance with Charlie. Nobody understood what they were looking at. Elvis gently handed the photograph back. "You were," he smiled warmly, "Mary Collins." Tears rolled down the woman's cheeks. "You remembered my name." "I remember everyone's name who believed in me before anyone else did." Several people gasped quietly. Mary laughed through her tears. "I was beginning to think I'd imagined that day." Elvis pulled out the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I sit?" She shook her head. "I've waited almost 15 years for this conversation." He sat. The audience remained standing. No one dared interrupt. Charlie quietly switched off the jukebox, so not even the faint electrical humming would disturb the moment. Mary carefully wiped her eyes. "You probably don't remember everything." Elvis smiled. "Try me." She looked at the photograph. "You came to our little church in Tupelo. I was 17. You hadn't made your first record yet. You borrowed somebody's guitar because yours had a broken string." Elvis chuckled. "I remember the broken string. You sang anyway." "I always did." Mary laughed softly. "And afterward," she hesitated, "everyone crowded around you. You looked terrified." The room smiled. It was difficult to imagine Elvis Presley ever being nervous. But Elvis nodded. "I was. You sat outside beside my father's truck. I brought you lemonade. You told me," her voice cracked, "that you hoped one day people would remember your songs." Elvis looked down at the wooden floor. "I said that?" "You did." She smiled through fresh tears. "And then I asked what you would do if the whole world knew your name." Elvis closed his eyes, almost as though he could hear the conversation happening again. "I answered." "You said," Mary whispered together with him, "I hope they still see the person singing." Silence. Complete silence. Danny felt chills race down his arms. Charlie slowly removed his glasses. Even the toughest construction workers stared at the floor. Because suddenly, the lonely man who had walked into the bar made perfect sense. Elvis leaned back in his chair. "I haven't thought about that conversation in years." Mary smiled sadly. "I have." She looked around the room. "The whole world learned your name. But tonight," she paused, "I think we finally met that young man again." Elvis didn't answer. He couldn't. Instead, he simply lowered his eyes. Danny remained near the stage. The guilt inside him grew heavier with every passing minute. He had spent the evening trying to embarrass a stranger. Instead, he had accidentally uncovered something deeply human. He quietly approached the table. "Mr. Presley." Elvis looked up. Danny took a deep breath. "I owe you more than an apology." "You don't owe me anything." "I do." Danny swallowed. "I've spent years trying to get laughs. I thought if people laughed, they'd remember me." He looked around the room. "But nobody's laughing now. And I don't think anyone will ever forget tonight." Elvis smiled gently. "Then maybe you learned something more valuable than another joke." Danny nodded. "What is it?" Elvis leaned back. "People rarely remember the loudest person in the room. They remember the honest one." Those words landed harder than any applause. Danny quietly repeated them to himself. The honest one. A young man near the back slowly raised his hand. He couldn't have been older than 20. He carried a worn guitar case resting beside his chair. "Mr. Presley?" Elvis smiled. "Yes? I've been driving from bar to bar every weekend trying to become a singer." Several people turned toward him. "My family says it's a waste of time. My friends tell me to find a real job." He hesitated. "I almost quit yesterday." The room became quiet once more. "I only came here tonight because somebody bought me a drink." He looked directly at Elvis. "What would you have done if nobody had believed in you?" Elvis didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at the guitar case. He recognized it instantly. Not the brand, the condition. Scuffed corners, worn leather, frayed handle. He had once carried one just like it. Finally, he spoke. "I'll tell you a secret." The young man leaned forward. "So did everyone else. I wasn't always confident. There were nights when I drove home wondering if the audience had been right. There were mornings when I thought about giving up music." A surprised murmur spread across the room. Elvis Presley! Thinking about quitting? It seemed impossible. But every time I came close, he smiled softly, someone unexpected gave me another reason to keep singing. He pointed toward Mary. Sometimes it was one kind word, then toward Charlie. Sometimes it was someone willing to play 3 simple chords, then toward Danny. Sometimes it was a challenge I didn't expect. Finally, he looked back at the young guitarist. "So don't spend your life waiting for everyone to believe in you. Sometimes, one person is enough." The young man's eyes filled with tears. "I think," he whispered, "I needed to hear that." Charlie suddenly stood from the piano bench. "I've got an idea." Everyone looked at him. He smiled nervously. "Mr. Presley, what if tonight wasn't only about remembering the past?" Elvis tilted his head. "What do you mean?" Charlie pointed toward the young guitarist. "Why don't you sing one with him?" The room erupted with excitement. The young man nearly dropped his guitar case. His face turned pale. "Me?" Charlie laughed. "Unless somebody else brought a guitar." The audience applauded. The young musician looked at Elvis with absolute disbelief. "I couldn't." Elvis stood. "Why not?" "Because I'd mess it up." Elvis smiled in a way that instantly relaxed the room. "My friend," he placed a reassuring hand on the young man's shoulder, "if you're afraid of making mistakes, then you're finally ready to make real music." The young man slowly unlatched his weathered guitar case. His hands were shaking so badly that he almost dropped the instrument. Elvis reached out and steadied it before it hit the floor. Their eyes met for a brief second. Then Elvis quietly said, "Let's make tonight unforgettable." The entire bar burst into applause once again, No one knew what song they were about to hear, but everyone could feel that the most extraordinary moment of the night had not happened yet. The applause rolled through the little bar like distant thunder before slowly fading into an expectant silence. Every eye remained fixed on Elvis Presley and the young guitarist standing beside him. The young man clutched his worn acoustic guitar so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. His breathing was uneven, his lips trembled. He had dreamed of standing beside Elvis Presley since he was a child. Now that dream felt terrifyingly real. Elvis noticed immediately. He leaned closer and spoke quietly enough that only the young man could hear. "What's your name, son?" "Luke." "How old are you?" 21. Elvis smiled. 21. He nodded to himself. "I was about your age when I realized fear never really goes away." Luke looked surprised. "You still get nervous?" Elvis chuckled. "Every single time." The answer shocked everyone close enough to hear. People imagined legends were fearless, but legends, Elvis knew, were simply ordinary people who learned to walk onto the stage despite their fear. He gently tapped the guitar. "You've carried this thing a long way." Luke nodded. "Almost 4 years." "You write songs?" "A few." "You sing them?" "Only when nobody's listening." Elvis laughed softly. "That's about to change." The room answered with warm laughter. The tension eased. For the first time since stepping onto the stage, Luke smiled. Charlie remained seated behind the old piano. He looked toward Elvis. "What should we play?" Elvis glanced at Luke. "You choose." Luke froze. I don't know." "What song reminds you why you started playing?" Luke looked down at his guitar. "My daddy used to sing Peace in the Valley." Several older guests exchanged emotional glances. It had always been one of Elvis's favorite gospel songs. Elvis nodded slowly. "Then that's our song." Charlie placed his fingers on the piano keys. This time, they weren't shaking anymore. The first gentle chords drifted through the room. Luke swallowed hard. His fingers found the opening notes. They were slightly uneven. He immediately apologized. "I'm sorry," Elvis smiled. "For what?" "I missed it." "No." Elvis shook his head. "You found it." The audience smiled. Luke laughed nervously. Then they began. Elvis didn't overpower the young man. He deliberately softened his own voice. He stepped back whenever Luke's verse arrived. He wasn't trying to prove who had the better voice. He was trying to give someone else the confidence to find his own. That simple decision transformed the performance into something unforgettable. Luke's voice cracked during the first verse. He looked embarrassed. Elvis simply nodded encouragingly. "Keep going." Luke took a deeper breath. The second verse came stronger. By the chorus, their voices blended together, young and experienced, hope and wisdom, dreams and memories. No one inside the bar could remember hearing anything so beautiful. Not because it was technically perfect, because it was real. Charlie watched the faces around the room. Several construction workers quietly wiped away tears. The elderly veteran removed his glasses. Mary closed her eyes and smiled. Danny felt something inside him change forever. For years, he had believed greatness meant standing in the spotlight alone. Tonight, he was watching the greatest entertainer in America do exactly the opposite. He was sharing it. When the final note faded, the silence lasted even longer than before. No one wanted to be the first to clap. They wanted to remain inside that moment for just a few seconds more. Finally, Charlie stood. He slowly placed both hands together. One clap, then another. Within moments, the little bar erupted into applause so powerful that people outside stopped walking just to discover what had happened inside. Luke lowered his head. He was crying openly now. He struggled to speak. I've never finished a song without being afraid. Elvis rested a hand on his shoulder. Now you know you can. Luke looked at him with tears in his eyes. What if nobody remembers me? Elvis smiled. The wrong question. Luke frowned. The right question is, he looked around the room. Did you make somebody feel something tonight? Luke slowly turned toward the audience. He saw tears, smiles, people hugging each other. Charlie still sitting quietly at the piano. Mary holding the old photograph against her heart. Danny staring at the stage as though his entire future had changed. Luke smiled. I think I did. Elvis nodded. Then you've already succeeded. Danny finally stepped forward once more, this time without a microphone, without jokes, without pretending to be the funniest man in the room. He looked directly at Elvis. I've spent years trying to make people notice me. Elvis waited. But tonight, Danny glanced around the room, I realized something. He smiled. The people who change lives aren't always the loudest. They're the ones who make everyone else believe they matter. The room grew quiet. Elvis looked almost embarrassed. I learned that from my mother. Danny nodded slowly. I'll remember it. Charlie walked behind the counter. Without saying anything, he picked up a blank receipt. He wrote today's date across the top, October 1970. Then he carried it back. Mr. Presley, I know everyone asks for autographs. But, he hesitated, I'd rather have a memory. Elvis smiled. What kind? Charlie handed him the receipt. Write something these people can read long after we're gone. Elvis stared at the blank paper. He thought for nearly a minute. No one interrupted him. Finally, he wrote just one sentence. He slid it back across the table. Charlie read the words aloud. Never sing to prove who you are. Sing because you know who you are. No signature, no title, just those words. Charlie carefully folded the receipt and slipped it into his wallet. I'll keep this forever. Outside, the cool Memphis night waited quietly. Jerry glanced at his watch inside the parked car. His friend had promised he'd be gone for 1 hour. Nearly 3 had passed. He laughed to himself. I knew it. At that exact moment, the front door finally opened. Elvis stepped outside. The distant sound of applause followed him into the street before the door gently closed again. Jerry smiled. So, you got recognized, Elvis laughed. A little. Jerry looked at him carefully. Something was different. The tired expression Elvis had carried earlier that evening had disappeared. He looked lighter, almost peaceful. What happened in there? Elvis looked back at the glowing neon sign above the little bar. You know, I think I remembered why I started singing. Jerry nodded without asking another question. Some stories didn't need explaining. Inside the bar, no one hurried home. People remained in their seats talking quietly about everything they had witnessed. Charlie carefully removed the microphone from its stand. He never allowed anyone else to use it again. Not because it was valuable, because it reminded him that greatness had once stood exactly there and had chosen kindness over applause. Danny never forgot that evening either. Years later, Whenever he stepped onto a stage, he stopped making jokes that humiliated people. Instead, he learned to make them laugh without taking away their dignity. He often told young comedians, "The greatest performer I ever met taught me that respect lasts longer than applause." He never had to mention Elvis by name. Those who knew understood. As for Luke, he continued playing music, not because he expected fame, not because he expected fortune, but because one unforgettable night had taught him that a single song could change the direction of a person's life. Whenever fear returned, he remembered one sentence: "Did you make somebody feel something tonight?" That became the measure of every performance he ever gave. Many years later, people still argued about whether Elvis Presley had really walked into that tiny Memphis bar on an ordinary Saturday night. Some insisted it was impossible. Others swore they had been there. Charlie would never argue with anyone. Whenever someone asked if the story was true, he simply smiled, looked toward the old piano that still stood in the corner, and replied, "I can't prove it, but every time someone sits down and plays Peace in the Valley, the room becomes just a little quieter, and somehow it feels like he's here again." Perhaps that was the greatest gift Elvis Presley ever left behind. Not the records, not the movies, not the sold-out arenas, but the quiet reminder that true greatness isn't measured by how brightly one person shines. It's measured by how many other lights they inspire to shine beside them. And on one ordinary autumn night in Memphis, inside a little neighborhood bar, the king didn't come looking for applause. He came looking for a moment of peace. Instead, he left behind something even more enduring: hope.